Howdy. Today we're going to be presenting our civil rights project. So, timeline glance. In 1849, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that segregating schools was allowed under the state's constitution. This precedent was later used to establish separate but equal doctrines. In 1865, the Civil War ends. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. And then in 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed, which banned racial discrimination in public accommodations. But this was short lived, as in 1883, the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, making segregation legal again. In 1890, the first Jim Crow laws were passed in Louisiana, and Plessy v. Ferguson finds Louisiana's separate but equal laws constitutional in 1896. In 1947, Westminster School District versus Menendez strikes down segregating Mexican American and white students, which this was a major precursor to the Brown case. And then in 1952, the first oral arguments of Brown v. Board are heard. And then in 1954, the Brown v. Board overturns the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling and declares segregation of schools as inherently unequal. So similarities and differences. Some differences you may see between then and now. Obviously, all schools in the U.S. are open to all students, no matter the skin color, and students of any skin color can attend university, which was a major step. But some similarities you'll see is racial discrimination is still a problem in many areas of the country. Many students do not have equal opportunity in schools due to lack of funding, so there's an equity difference there. And then minority students are often targets of racial discrimination by higher ups within the school system. So this could be principals, teachers, resource officers that may end up discriminating against students of different races.
So today I'm going to talk about before and after Brown v. Board. So the historical context, we see that Plessy v. Ferguson was enforced in 1896, which reinforced segregation in schools deemed separate but equal. Public schools for Black students were systematically underfunded and lacked resources compared to those for white students. Jim Crow laws upheld racial segregation across southern states and many parts of the North. School environments, like their facilities for Black students, were in poor condition. They were overcrowded, lacked heating, plumbing, and essential materials. Resources were outdated. They had used textbooks, insufficient supplies, lack of textbooks, and hindered quality of education. So many Black teachers were underpaid, overworked, and in challenging working environments. But despite this, many were highly dedicated to their students' success. Curriculum focused on manual labor or vocational training, limiting opportunities for higher education or skilled professions. And then I'm going to point back to Black teachers. Even after Brown v. Board, we find a lot of them losing their jobs due to this. So many Black students walked long distances while white students had buses. Communities of color and civil rights organizations like the NAACP pushed for educational equity. We saw a large impact on communities because of the school systems. Early court cases challenged unequal funding and resources, and this laid the groundwork for Brown versus Board. And then we're going to find after Brown versus Board, many of these things stayed the same, even though the court's decision was overturned. It declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, which we just talked about, emphasized that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. There was immediate resistance in the South. We see school closures and private academies. We had to have federal intervention because of the South and certain things, as seen in Little Rock 9. There was slow progress towards integration, even nowadays. In the first decade, integration was slow, with many districts maintaining segregated systems through loopholes. So there was busing and redistricting all the way in the 60s and 70s, and this accelerated desegregation. The de facto segregation persisted due to housing patterns, which we know as white flight, and economic inequality. Racial disparities in school funding, disciplinary policies, and academic opportunities remained significant. Were schools truly integrated? This is even a great question, and I think it is very prevalent in our modern day society because modern schools reflect racial and socioeconomic divides, with many schools in predominantly minority areas underfunded, and we just see a perpetual system that leads that. And while legal segregation ended, systematic inequalities and inequities still remain.
So the first question I asked my mom was, what did the Brown case mean to you? What did you think it would mean, and what has it meant in the end? And how did it affect your life? So my mom is a teacher, an elementary school teacher. So she said that she no longer sees a direct segregation of students based on skin color, but there is an indirect segregation of students due to socioeconomic factors. So that's kind of what it's meant in the end for what she's seen. And then I asked her, what were your experiences with segregated or integrated schools, and what was the racial makeup of the students and teachers? So she's taught in three schools. The first one had 91% Black students, the second one 92% Black students, and the third one 8% Black students. And what she also saw is schools one and two had above 90% of students who were economically disadvantaged, while school three only had 41%. And then all three schools only had 0 to 2 Black teachers. Um, and then in schools with a high percentage of students with a low socioeconomic status, most of the time also having a large percentage of Black students, teachers and staff also have to meet needs such as food, clothing, health, and counseling, which takes away time from instruction. And she also talked about how they're seeing like long-term effects of the older generations and families historically dealing with school segregation and also lacking educational opportunities. And then while my mom was in school, she said she only had 2 Black kids in her elementary school, and they were siblings, and this was in 1981. And she said they weren't really excluded, but a lot of adults, including her grandparents, would talk and ask questions about the 2 Black kids. And then also she became friends with a Black girl in high school. But this girl faced a lot of resentment in school and then later in life when she married a white man. And then I just wanted to share this like direct quote from my mom. She said, as a reading specialist, I am often assigned to travel from one campus to another. Within my school district, the schools and resources vary significantly, and so does the racial makeup of students. In addition, when teachers are tasked with analyzing data, we look at assessment results in subcategories which are based on race and economic status. The purpose of this task is to bring awareness to underperforming groups. Black students consistently perform lower on standardized tests, so analyzing this data doesn't solve this issue. It seems schools need to consider a different approach to ensure equal educational opportunities for students. So I put these two graphs on here to kind of just show like what my mom is saying, like is true and widespread. So the first one just shows how Black students are consistently underperforming compared to white students. And then also included this one about funding. So my mom talked about a different approach. So maybe this different approach could include giving the schools with lower socioeconomic statuses and um, a higher population of Black students more funding.
So the person I interviewed, she's a school teacher. She's in her early 30s and she's a part of the Hispanic community. And I asked her, what did the Brown case mean to you? She said, as a member of the Hispanic population here in Texas, I believe the Brown v. Board of Education ruling had a direct effect on my schooling for many years later. Though most Americans see two distinct groups when referring to the time period before the civil rights movement, it goes without saying that Mexicans did not fall under whites only. I will not answer this question with the attitude that Hispanics had the same experience as that of African Americans or vice versa. I was not there, and I can only speak for myself when I say that I was able to attend the school nearest my home without fear of discrimination. This would not have been the case even 40 years ago, and the fact that I feel so far removed from the time period is a testament to the advancement propelled by court cases such as Brown v. Board of Education. I then asked her, what did you think it would mean and what has it meant in the end? And she said, though I was not part of all that led up to the civil rights movement, I have most certainly benefited from the work of the activists who came before me. As far as what has it meant in the end, I do not yet feel as though we have reached the end. America has come a long way, and I do believe we are still moving towards equality, though we are not there just yet. And then I asked her, how has it affected your life? And she said, in regards to this specific case, I have never faced any fear of attending school where I would not be welcomed. As a child, I did not have to worry about whether my skin would make a single difference in how well I would be taught or the kind of resources that I would have access to. And then I asked her what were her experiences with segregated or integrated schools. And she said, I attended an integrated school, and so did my parents. Growing up in a small rural Texas, I did not know that segregated school would have ever existed in Stockdale. However, as a teacher, I've taught in bigger cities where the demographics almost made it feel as if segregation still exists today, and part of me believes it still does in some areas. So then I went on to ask her what was the racial makeup of the students and teachers in those bigger city schools, and she said one of them is specifically that she taught Nama or Nauman Forest High School in Garland, Texas. She said today their enrollment there is around 91% minority. And then I asked, how quickly and fully do you think schools desegregated? And she said, I do not feel as though schools desegregated quickly. And this had been a way of life for many years, and the South was not willing to suddenly change everything they knew. This reminded me of a court case that introduced the idea of segregation as more of a national issue than a Southern one. And then finally, I asked her, "Do you believe in the Brown v. Board? What Brown v. Board of Education stands for?" She said, "I absolutely believe in what Brown v. Board of Education stands for. Separate but equal is a contradiction. The very definition of separate constitutes the idea people cannot live peacefully together because of their differences. The court case was the beginning of a necessary mind shift." So I interviewed my grandparents for our civil rights projects. Both of them have drastically different stories and experience of this time period. My grandmother grew up in Beeville, Texas, and my grandpa was living in Japan during this time period because his father was serving in the Air Force. My grandfather lived on many different military bases, and he never noticed any segregation happening because they were all serving for the same cause, is what he told me. Specifically in 1954, my grandfather was 4 and my grandmother was 2, so they didn't really experience the effects of Brown v. Board until the elementary level, which is about 1960. And then on the next slide, you'll see the differentiation of G and P. It's just my grandmother answering or my grandpa answering. And then the first question I asked them was, did you even notice schools or public places were segregated? My grandmother said she noticed it, but it was never a conscious thought and never really an issue in the community, which was very unique because I know during this time period, a lot of communities faced riots and boycotts. And then my grandfather said the military bases he was on were never segregated. He said that was mainly due to the federal government not wanting to have to pay for separate facilities. And then I asked my grandmother, how was schooling during segregation and desegregation? She said she was very young, around second or third grade, and her schooling didn't change much at all. It was kind of hard for her to think of any issues that may have occurred. And she said to her and everyone around her, it was just like she was getting a bunch of new friends at school. Um, and then I asked her, well, how did the community react? And she said her community actually was very excited. They didn't have any problem with desegregation. And it was mainly because it was a heavily influenced by football town. And the community was very excited for the 2 high schools to integrate so that they could start dominating the surrounding towns in sports like football, basketball, track, but mainly football. And then I asked my grandfather, was military-based schooling different? And he actually went to private Catholic schools, but he said everyone that he knew that went to military-based school all went to the same school. There was no differentiation between any race. And specifically, he was living in Japan at this time period. So the majority of the people who lived on base were white, Japanese, or any other race. And he said they all went to the same school, they all used the same facilities, they all got the same opportunities. The only thing he did say was while he was going to private Catholic school, the only segregation he noticed was he went to a boys only school and his sister went to a girls only school. So that was very interesting to me because we still have that separation of boys only and girls only schools today. And then I asked my grandmother how long did it take to fully desegregate her town. Her town wasn't desegregated until the 1960s, but uniquely, she told me the story about how the Black community went to the train station and stopped what they called the Northern Aggressioners, but the NAACP representatives, and told them that they needed to go home. They didn't want to be desegregated. And the reason they told them was because they were content being segregated from the white population and that they had a better life being segregated. She said mainly it was because they had their own education system, they had their own living facilities, they had their own shopping facilities, and they didn't want to integrate within the white culture. They wanted to keep themselves apart.
And then I asked them if they had any other stories. My grandmother was telling me about how her grandparents were actually born in the end of the 1800s, and she doesn't remember them at all having an issue with desegregation or even really having a public opinion on it. She said most of the time her family did vote towards the people who would lead towards desegregation, but often at time not many white people would have a public opinion on that, or want to state that they were doing that. She even told me that she never heard her parents use any racial slurs, which was a common practice at the time, even though their parents used it regularly, which just shows that there was generational change during this time period, which was interesting. And then she also told me about how the portion of Texas that she lived in never really had a slavery issue because the portion that she was from was more ranch towns and didn't need slaves because the labor wasn't the type of strenuous labor that you would see in the Deep South on plantations. And then I had the unique ability to interview my grandparents about their experience of integration at Texas A&M during the 1960s and 70s. My grandfather was part of the class of 1971, and he was in the Corps. He said he never experienced integration issues, but mainly because A&M was a military school to begin with, so integration had kind of already happened to some degree, and that they were all serving together as brothers. He remembers his first year was considered like boot camp. I don't know if that's now. And they were taught that they are all the same and they will be treated all the same. And he specifically said that the commanders would not tolerate any type of mistreatment of anyone because they are all property of the Corps. And then my grandmother was actually part of the first women class of 1974. She said the school faced more issues with integrating women into the school than any other race, integrating races. She said specifically many professors did not believe that women should be there. And she was telling me how she remembers a professor telling her to go home and do what she was supposed to do, which was have babies and raise a household. She didn't follow the normal flow of the normal women degree. She was actually a STEM student. And then my grandpa was telling me how they referred to the women class of 1974 as 1974 because of the integration issues that the women faced. Many of them would actually commit suicide and jump off of some of the dorm buildings here on campus. And so it just shows like there was a lot of integration issues within women and all of the adversities that they faced here at Texas A&M.
So for our connection to class material, the first quote I wanted to include was from our most recent reading, and it says, "At the same time, and in spite of the historic Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court ruling outlawing so-called separate but equal schools for white and black children, a 2014 report from the Civil Rights Project found that public schools in some parts of the nation have experienced an unprecedented backslide towards de facto separate and unequal education. This in spite of the fact that a 2014 study found that integrated schools have been found to have substantial benefits for educational and later life outcomes for students from all backgrounds." So I think this relates to what we've discussed in class and how many schools didn't achieve integration till 20 plus years later. But now we're still seeing the effects of this coming back and still negatively affecting students in schools today. Next, we connected this to the self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think like one of the biggest ways in which schools are still segregated is through socioeconomic issues. And a quote from the self-fulfilling prophecy article was, "For low-income students and students of color, it is the compounding of a myriad of small factors that ultimately accrete into significant classroom challenges that may appear as academic improficiencies." And then finally, Brown v. Board cannot be effective without multicultural education. This is a quote from Banks and Banks. It says, "Multicultural education grew out of the ferment of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The first responses of schools and educators to the ethnic movements of the 1960s were hurried. Courses and programs were developed without the thought and careful planning needed to make them educationally sound or to institutionalize them within the educational system." So multicultural education was coming about just after Brown v. Board, but it wasn't done effectively. So like we've talked about, we still see the negative effects of this on students in schools today. And then, so multicultural education is necessary for Brown v. Board to be effective because multicultural education provides a practical technique to support the decision of Brown v. Board. And thank you for listening to our presentation.